Enrique Pena Nieto prepares to assume the presidency of Mexico. In what condition has Felipe Calderón left the country? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. When Pena Nieto is inaugurated in Mexico City on Saturday, it will mark the return to power for the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI. Pena Nieto has promised his government will be, quote, modern, democratic and transparent, end quote, in contrast to the autocracy and corruption that characterized the 71 years of PRI rule that concluded in 2000. There is much to do. More than 60,000 people lost their lives over the last 6 years in Felipe Calderón's war on drugs. The U.S. State Department currently advises Americans not to visit 19 of Mexico's 31 states. The Mexican economy hardly thrived under Calderón. Growth rates have been sluggish and poverty rates increased while he was in power. What's more, Pena Nieto will have to deal with the concerns of what began as the student movement, Yo Soy 132, and has developed into a broad-based coalition opposing the PRI's return to power. Al Jazeera's Lucia Newman has been assessing President Calderón's legacy.
The city of Cuernavaca used to be an oasis of peace and tranquility, a place where the people of Mexico City used to come as a holiday retreat or a weekend retreat to enjoy the pleasant climate. But like so many parts of Mexico, the city of Cuernavaca, known as the city of the eternal spring, has now become the city of constant bloodshed. When President Felipe Calderón took office 6 years ago, he declared an all-out war against organized crime and the drug cartels. He brought out the army, and he did manage to arrest some of the top leaders of many of the cartels. But instead of bringing them down, as he had promised, they simply multiplied and spread. As a result, Mexico has not seen so much carnage since the days of the Mexican Revolution. What you see here is a shrine to the victims, to some of the victims in the city of Cuernavaca. You see not only signs for people asking for peace, but also for justice, because impunity has been the order of the day during this so-called drug war. And it isn't just the criminal organizations and the drug cartels that are responsible for the killing. For example, here is a huge poster. It says that this young man was arrested by the army. He was tortured, then murdered, and actually his body disintegrated in acid. There are many, many accusations of gross human rights violations on the part of the federal police and the army. All of this has happened under President Felipe Calderón, and it has overshadowed some of his accomplishments. For example, he has overseen a period of relative economic growth and stability in Mexico, even as the global economy has seen a downturn. He's also improved public health services. But again, all that overshadowed by the violence that he will be leaving behind. And it's the kind of violence that no one knows how it will end or whether his successor, Enrique Pena Nieto, will be able to really do anything to turn it around.
So, what are the key challenges facing Enrique Pena Nieto? To discuss this, we're joined from Mexico City by Rodrigo Serrano. He's one of the founders of the Yo Soy, or I Am, 132 movement. Also in Mexico City, Laura Carlsen, director of the Americas program at the Center for International Policy. And from Williamsburg, Virginia, we're joined by George Grayson, professor of Latin American politics at the College of William and Mary. Rodrigo Serrano, let me begin with you then. You and your group and other groups have planned protests this weekend to coincide with the inauguration. What are you planning and why?
Actually, 132 is planning some artistic actions. We are calling it #1DMX. With that hashtag, you can follow all the action. It will be some performances, some theatrical plays, music concerts, and we're protesting about the imposition, but not against the president, but the whole system, the whole corrupt democracy that is not really hearing the citizens. You know, here in Mexico, we don't really feel represented by the government.
Right, so you use that term imposition, and now we have the CNI, the National Convention Against the Imposition, under which many groups are discussing the election. I mean, the main contention, first of all, then, is this was not a free and fair election. Is that correct, Rodrigo?
Yeah, that's right.
So what are you demanding, though? What do you want to see happen?
132 actually right now is demanding truly democracy. It's demanding more democratization in the media, because in Mexico the media are held just by two companies, two very big companies that are really monsters, and we don't really have freedom of speech. You know, we have all this self-censorship for the rating. So that's the first demand, and we're not demanding something from the president right now, but we are showing him that we're still alive, we are fighting for a best Mexico, and we're not getting quiet, you know?
Laura Carlsen, I mean, how widespread then, how broad-based is the opposition to Pena Nieto's inauguration even? I mean, how many people still feel it wasn't a fair election? What evidence is there that it was a fair election?
Well, if you add together the students and the young people who are involved in the 132 movement, and then the political opposition that was behind the center-left candidate Andrés Manuel López Obrador and presented formal legal challenges to the elections, then you've got a sizable portion of the population. Of course, many of them won't necessarily protest tomorrow, but there still are doubts about the legitimacy of the election, not so much as to whether he really won the vote, because there was a 3 million vote difference, but as to what kind of tactics his campaign used in terms of the widespread vote buying. And this is a particular concern to Mexican citizens because his party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI, has a long history of using fraudulent practices in elections, and not only that, but of governing with corruption. So when Rodrigo says that the movement's going to be around, it means that they're making a statement, we're going to be here, we're going to still be pressing for democracy, and we're going to be watching what you're doing.
And I suppose, Professor Grayson, I mean, that's all particularly important as the PRI insists it's changed. It's no longer the bad old PRI of the old days. But however, having said that, George Grayson, we don't see too much concern, though, about even the possibility that the PRI bought this election north of the border, do we?
We don't have much concern in the United States, but Pena Nieto's campaign spent hundreds of millions of dollars. And I would agree with Dr. Carlsen that the actual vote was reasonably fair, but so much money went into the mass media and in mailings and in various incentives for people to vote that
incentives meaning
like an
bribery,
American
right?
election. Gifts, credit cards,
right?
Admission to grocery stores.
Yeah, I'm only asking because I think we're going to get on to how much the PRI has changed in a few minutes. But first of all, okay, let's look at Mexico as it is and how Felipe Calderon, I mean, the Mexico that Pena Nieto is inheriting. Beginning with the economy. Since Felipe Calderon took office in December 2006, the number of people living in poverty, making less than $100 a month, rose from 43% to 46%. The government says 2.6 million jobs were created in 6 years, but that fell short of the estimated 6 million needed to meet the demands of a rapidly expanding population. During Calderon's term, the economy grew by 1.6%. However, the average growth rate during the term of Vicente Fox was 2.2%. The growth rate under Ernesto Zedillo, the last PRI member to hold the presidency, was 3.5%. Professor Grayson, it's interesting because if you look at the headlines in the FT or the Economist, you wouldn't perhaps guess at that kind of economic stagnation. Mexico's being hailed as a great economic miracle, the place where the world does business, according to the Economist. It's strange, isn't it? There's a disconnect.
Well, the macroeconomic policy has been first rate. But the problem is the distribution of income. And by and large, the elite don't care a tired rat's derriere about poor people. And they would just as soon export them to the United States or forget about them. You have quite low tax collections. You have an educational system that has been colonized by an extremely venal union. And the economy is shot through with monopolies, oligopolies, and bottlenecks.
So so I guess, Laura Carlsen, I mean, I guess that Professor Grayson is expressing an opinion we often hear that the only problem is there hasn't been enough deregulation, there hasn't been enough neoliberal policy to free up the Mexican economy. What do you make of that argument, Laura?
No, I think that argument has been completely disproven, because Mexico is the country that's had the longest experience with a free trade agreement and with the top-down imposition of these kinds of policies. And what we're seeing, as we're seeing in other parts of the world, is that trickle-down doesn't work. They're using these macroeconomic statistics as if everything were going fine, while ignoring, as Professor Grayson says, the inequality in the distribution of wealth. And now we no longer have the migration as an escape valve, because the border's been shut up and there aren't jobs in the United States. So the situation is actually getting worse rather than better.
Rodrigo Serrano, what are you looking for in a Pena Nieto term? Has he been specific about his policies, his economic policies moving forward? He says he understands that the gap between the rich and poor has to close. He says he understands poverty has to end. What's he offering, do you think?
We don't really are seeing any offer, you know. Until now, the Pena Nieto politics hasn't been really clear. We know that he belongs to an political school in Mexico, very adept to the free commerce and all that, but we do believe that they are not really caring about the social programs or the distribution of the money, of the richness of the country.
But Laura Carlsen, isn't there a sense, though, that the PRI is at least less neoliberal, less ideologically neoliberal than Calderon's party, the PAN, and of course it does have strong links to unions. I mean, so can it really put in place the kind of the extreme neoliberal deregulation that many, certainly in the US, would be calling for?
Well, that used to be the case because it was more nationalist. And it also was more known for a stronger state role in the economy. But that does not seem to be the case any longer, especially since the presidency of Carlos Salinas de Gortari. Now, for example, you have the pre-candidate and now president-to-be, Pena Nieto, calling for privatization of the state-owned oil company. Now, that's an extreme neoliberal measure that the World Bank and the US government have been pressing for years, if not decades, that other governments couldn't get through, including the conservative governments. And now with the political power of the PRI and this turn toward the free market economy that's been taking place over the past couple of decades, it's likely that they will ride roughshod over popular discontent with the measure and carry out even some more extreme neoliberal reforms than the conservative governments were able to do.
Professor Grayson, I suppose a lot depends on what Pena Nieto actually believes, actually even whether he's even in charge. I mean, many people think that Carlos Salinas is actually still in charge, the sort of the neoliberal pre-president of YOR, who you know, is under various corruption scandals. But what do you make of it? What do you see happening now?
Well, I think the Salinas argument is absolute nonsense. The person who's going to be the quarterback in this new administration is Luis Videgaray Caso. And he's tough, he's intelligent, and he's ambitious. And I think he's going to be calling the shots either from the finance ministry or as chief of staff
well, what does he believe?
For the president. He went to MIT. He's generally a free market advocate, but whether or not you can touch some of the sacred cows like Pemex or like the teachers union or like the large media conglomerates remains to be seen.
But I mean, I guess we go back to then what how the PRI has ruled in the past, and they've managed to do so with that combination of patronage and corruption and repression in some cases. I mean, do you think these are relevant concepts as we look at the coming PRI government as they try and institute a neoliberal economic agenda, Professor Grayson?
Well, neoliberalism is a very flexible word. The problem is you've got the richest man in the world who owns the majority of the telephone service in Mexico. Mexico's got the first or second largest cement industry, owned by the Zambrano family. The media, the large networks, are owned by a handful of people. And so I don't see this as liberalization, but there's got to be some opening in the oil industry, or Mexico is going to be a net importer of oil within 10 years, and oil accounts for 1/3 of its federal budget.
Rodrigo Serrano, what do you think of when you hear that this may be the forthcoming agenda of Pena Nieto?
I do believe that we're not living in the past. You know, maybe the PRI will not govern as they did, but we do believe that they has really strong groups inside the party that goes for the repression and doesn't really want to hear. They just want to do the things the same way they had been doing all the time. So in the first place, in the economic field, we do believe that the privatization will not really work, as it hasn't really worked in Mexico historically. And we believe that actually all the benefits of the economy will go to some corrupt unions and some corrupt groups that has been always there. Like the teachers union is a union with a very dark history, and they are not letting the education in Mexico to move forward. You know, the PRI has very strong links with that union and with some other groups that belongs to the clientelar state, the corporativist state that they used to govern.
Laura Carlsen, help us unpick all that then. So are we suggesting that these unions aren't progressive, you know, socialist organizations, but simply in there for their own power? I mean, when we hear those criticisms of the unions and how close they are to the corrupt oligarchy, I mean, how do we understand that?
Well, this goes back to the prehistory. I mean, this is a structural problem. The unions are part and were part of the party formally. And that's what corporatism is. It's where you take popular sectors and you actually integrate them into the party, and that's what sustained one-party rule for 71 years. So corruption is an integral part of these unions, along with the relationship with the government. And they are a significant block to progress in Mexico. There are very few independent unions. The concept of a union is still a valid concept, and there have been many important fights to have independent.
But when you say
unions.
progress, Laura,
But
I think you mean something different to what Professor Grayson means when he says progress.
Well, progress would be breaking down these major unions that are a block and progress would be, yeah, I think possibly we do on some points. I mean, I'm not sure about that, but in general, I would be against the privatization for the reasons that Rodrigo mentioned, because I think that it hasn't worked and it's made people very wealthy. You can't say that state management of Pemex has worked either, but that doesn't mean that you give up on it. It means that there have been some major mistakes. A lot of them had to do with the corruption of the PRI government and then the PAN governments after that, and the way they bleed the oil industry in order to fund deficits in other parts of the government. But that could technically be fixed without transferring the resources from the public to private hands, where it's very unlikely that the public would get any benefits from it.
Professor Grayson, I mean, isn't that the point that even if you believe that privatization is a good thing, one thing we know is that when you have privatizations in fundamentally corrupt structures and countries, it's a disaster. It just basically means you know, a handful of people get control and the nation suffers.
But that's what is the case now. And Carlos Romero Deschamps, who is the leader of the Oil Workers Union, is one of the wealthiest, one of the most corrupt individuals in the country, and everyone knows it. So I don't think things can get worse, but unless you find a way to get private capital into the oil industry, Mexico is going to become a net oil importer within 10 years. And that's 1/3 of its budget. It just simply can't continue with the dogma, el petróleo es el nuestro. That's as outdated as I think the buggy whip is.
All right, well, let's move on to another part of Felipe Calderón's legacy, the war on drugs, which is actually often the only story that we hear about Mexico in the US, certainly. Felipe Calderón argued that he had a legal and moral obligation to launch an attack on drug traffickers after his contested election. These are the results. He deployed federal troops against them days after he took office in December 2006. Now some 45,000 army soldiers and 20,000 federal police officers are deployed across the country. The number of homicides, though, rose 36% over the previous administration, at least 101,199 over the course of the 6-year term. In 2006, though, there were 3,300 hectares of land under cultivation for illegal drugs. By 2012, that number had ballooned to 19,500. Professor Grayson, as we look back on Calderon's war on drugs, I mean, is there any success that we can suggest came from it? What is the legacy?
He has been able to capture or kill probably about 30 kingpins. But this so-called kingpin strategy is often self-defeating because the lieutenants in the cartel then vie for the leadership. And moreover, rival cartels compete for the turf of the decapitated leader. And so I think Pena Nieto will move away from the broadsword approach of sending tens of thousands of troops after the cartels and instead use a scalpel that is eavesdropping, drones, the use of informants, following the flow of money, which I think will make much more sense than the Calderon approach.
Laura Carlsen, do you think that makes more sense?
Yes and no. It's certainly much better than this broad deployment of military people and police in the communities, which have led to, the movement now says, 80,000 deaths in the last 6 years. But the major problem is much deeper. The problem is that, is this what you do to stop drugs? And when you look at other alternatives, like health-based alternatives, including legalization and moving away from prohibitionist policies in the United States. Of course, the legalization of marijuana in Colorado and Washington has stirred a major debate here in Mexico, saying, well, if the people in the United States don't even really care about prohibiting these substances, why are we paying with 80,000 dead here in Mexico to do their dirty work? So the problem really isn't even so much how do you break down the cartels, but how do you strangle them? I would be very much in agreement that going after the money is by far a more effective and less bloody way to do it. And I think these other things, the health-based approach and legalization, are other things that have to be taken into account, as well as social policies here in Mexico.
Rodrigo Serrano, your views on this particular issue?
Yeah, I do believe that the security strategy hasn't been the best. You know, fight the cartels with violence will just increase the violence and the deaths. We do believe that Mexico needs something like a new social pact where we all can discuss about the legalization, what's right, what's wrong, and what is being Mexican, you know, because right now the criminals doesn't really feel Mexican, or they don't feel that the government is Mexican, so they can drift away from society and become this beast.
But Professor Grayson, when we've talked to Mexican politicians and former Mexican politicians in the past, they say, look, we all know this is a mess, but the fact is the US won't allow us to take any alternative strategies. How much leeway does Pena Nieto have to move away from the security crackdown-based strategy of Calderon?
Well, I think it's absolutely not true that the United States dictates Mexico's drug policy.
Well, it's an unspoken
thing, perhaps. What we're finding is that
the leverage.
Well, what we found since 1997 is that there's been a stalemate between the executive and federal branches in Mexico City. And so government and power have devolved to the governors, most of whom are members of the PRI. And these governors either aid and abet the cartels or they turn a blind eye to them. And that's the dirty little secret that neither Mexican nor U.S. politicians want to talk about.
Well, I suppose very quickly, Laura, I mean, isn't that the way the PRI has traditionally acted? I mean, they pick a few winners in the, amongst the drug cartels, and I mean, that was always what many assumed the PRI would do if they returned to power. They would make alliances with some drug cartels. Is there any evidence of that?
Well, there is in some states. However, there are just too many cartels now, and there are too many proto-cartels, that is, gangs that are extremely vicious. And so there's not one or two mafioso with whom you could cut a deal, even if you wanted to, which isn't to say that in some states like Veracruz, deals don't get cut.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there, but that's a quick overview of some of the challenges facing Pena Nieto in his first term in office. Professor George Grayson, thank you very much. Laura Carlsen, thank you. Rodrigo Serrano, thank you as well. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.